Professor Cygan. He's professor at the University of Leicester. He has been visiting professors in different universities in Europe, especially in Italy. And his research interests are in the field of European public law and governance. He has a very good work on the relationship between national parliaments and EU institutions in the context of the decision-making process. And in relation to Brexit, in the last year he has been an expert, a consultant in the British Parliament. So it's one of the most prepared professors in the UK to speak about this topic. Thank you very much, Adam, for being here, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Isaac, and thank you for the invitation to everybody. It's been absolutely fantastic, and I have to say how jealous I am of your faculty. It's beautiful. It's one of the most amazing buildings I've visited in a long time. So to Brexit. And I can sort of feel the groans already in the room when I start to talk about Brexit, because we'd all thought it was sort of going to be over and done with by now. But one thing I would just say to you is, don't look at Brexit as an event. Brexit is a process. It is something which will continue beyond every new deadline. Whether the UK and the EU meet that deadline, Brexit will continue. We will probably still be talking about the consequences of Brexit in 10 years' time. And within that period, it was going to have a profound effect upon the United Kingdom's constitutional and institutional structures, but it will also have a profound effect, I think, on the European Union and the process of European Union integration. Because, if nothing else, Brexit challenges some of those key preconceptions that we have come to take for granted as being part of European integration. And the title of my presentation is Brexit Means Brexit, is partly a sort of a parody of what the Prime Minister said on the day that she was elected as leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister, where she stood up and said, Brexit means Brexit. But I'm asking the question, well, does it? Because what we can see of the Brexit process over the last 2 years is that Brexit doesn't necessarily mean the UK leaving the European Union on its own terms. It requires the UK to come to a divorce agreement, a settlement under Article 50 with the European Union. And this is the first mistake, I think, that the United Kingdom made, that it believed that Brexit was something that could be resolved unilaterally by the United Kingdom determining how it wanted to leave, on what terms, and how quickly. Now, so over the last 2 years, and I still continue to be working on a research project which is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, the ESRC, in the United Kingdom, and together with an organisation called the UK and a Changing Europe. And after the referendum result, the Funding Council, the ESRC, put in a call for what they called Brexit priority grants, to look at how the UK, across a range of issues, is responding to Brexit. And with my two colleagues who are political scientists from the School of Politics, Dr. Richard Whittaker, Dr. Phil Lynch, we were successful in a grant which we titled Parties, Parliament and the Brexit Process. And what we have done is to look at how Parliament has sought to implement Brexit, but also looked at the consequences of Brexit for not just the Constitution and the UK institutions, but also how Brexit has had an effect upon political parties. So what we can see is that Brexit has not just created divisions between political parties, it's created divisions within political parties. And that has had a real effect upon why we are in the mess that we are in today. There are so many different versions of what MPs want from Brexit that they can't agree amongst themselves. Now, the funding call talked about there was a lot of priority issues that they were identified, but we picked on two. So what is Brexit in UK party politics? And I think this is partly where we begin to see why the referendum result went the way that it did. Now, if we go back to the mid-1990s, or the early 1990s, in fact, with the Maastricht Treaty, when Euroscepticism began becoming quite prominent in the United Kingdom, Euroscepticism was talked about in terms of constitutional sovereignty. Parliament is sovereign, that we are having laws imposed upon us by these foreign institutions and we have no control of them. Probably one could say that's an argument to make out for that that's correct, but that didn't resonate with the public. What changed the debate about Europe was populism. So we shifted from talking about constitutional sovereignty to taking control of our borders, our money, and our laws. So this idea that somehow the UK needs to take back control. And that's the language of Brexit. And that is why the referendum equated so well with the mood of many people who thought they were being ruled by some organization which they have no control over, and we will take back control from that organization. So I think that's very important to understand. The political discourse around Brexit changed, particularly with the UK Independence Party and Nigel Farage and that sort of media campaign which was very effective. The second thing that we were concerned with, and which I will probably be talking about more today, is the legal issues of Brexit. And one of the consequences of Brexit is it means the repatriation of competences. So those things that the European Union has been deciding upon for the last 45 years, those policies are now going to come back to the UK. And the UK Parliament will be legislating. But this raises a number of issues. Firstly, does the UK want to remain aligned with EU rules, or does it want to diverge from them? So does the UK want to follow EU rules on employment protection or environmental standards in the future, or does it want to diverge from them and have its own rules? And these are choices which our Parliament will have to make. And these will be our MPs, the UK MPs, who will now be responsible for these decisions. So the objectives of what we're doing are to sort of looking at how Brexit process affected UK party politics, looking at how, sort of developing knowledge of how Parliament has responded to Brexit in terms of structures and procedures, and in particular exploring those areas of policy most subject to conflict post-Brexit. So repatriation of competences and this idea of alignment versus divergence. And we've been working with an organisation called the Industry and Parliament Trust, which is a body within Parliament, where we have spoken with a large number of MPs, peers, officials in Parliament, together with industry and business organisations across a whole range of areas of the economy to try and decide what are the issues, what are the key issues that are going to be affecting them going forward. Now, this all started with the 2016 referendum and the decision of the then Prime Minister David Cameron to promise a referendum in the Conservative Party manifesto in 2015. Now, trying to sort of make sense of the referendum in terms of, and I was interested when you were framing it about 25 years of talking about Europe here, and I wanted to look at Brexit in the context of EU integration and where does it sit within that. So I think firstly, the referendum result should be viewed or may be viewed as a repudiation by the UK of the EU's constitutional and institutional framework of governance. It doesn't want to be part of that institutional framework any longer, and that's the treaties which govern that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, in terms of EU integration, Brexit should be viewed as a rejection of the community method. This idea of pooling sovereignty and moving towards legislative harmonisation. So the UK is taking the view that it no longer needs to harmonise with the 27 other member states, that it is capable of solving these problems itself without the need for further cooperation. So it's also then, in terms of a theoretical understanding, I would say it's sort of a repudiation. It doesn't fit in easily with this idea of neo-functionalist theory of ever closer integration. Or does it? I mean, I think the first thing we should say is that Brexit should not be seen as something which is necessarily going to mean that the UK is no longer going to be, quote, Europeanized. And if we look at the history of European integration, there are a number of examples of things that we can point, which would say not being part of the European integration in its entirety doesn't necessarily affect European integration or participation in it. So, for example, the UK has had an opt-out of Schengen and the protocol on 36 on criminal justice. It doesn't participate in the euro. But it's not just the UK. Denmark and Ireland both have constitutional guarantees within the treaty. So the European Union is flexible enough to be able to accommodate already different aspects or different approaches towards integration. Take on that, for example, add to that the relationship with Norway and the EEA and the EFTA countries and its relationship with Switzerland, which is different from Norway's. We can see that being flexible is something the European Union can also do. So perhaps we could just view Brexit as an extreme form of variable geometry, that the UK is going to be doing something different, but not necessarily repudiating many of those core values. And I'll come back to that point later. And I think here is the crucial thing, is that what we've seen with Brexit is a challenge to those ideas of integration which have been prominent in the UK since 1972. And the way I've tried to sort of explain this is that there's been what I call a Europeanization of the United Kingdom during its membership. So the European Communities Act of 1972 is the piece of legislation which brings EU law into the UK. It guarantees the supremacy of EU law in the UK, and there are a number of principles like supremacy which continue to apply notwithstanding the UK is leaving. So we heard a lot at the European Council in, I think it was on the 9th or 10th of April, where the Commission and the Council, the European Council, were talking about sincere cooperation having to be maintained whilst the UK is a withdrawing member state. And the UK continues to be bound by all the rules and obligations of EU law. And indeed, at that council, it was mooted, supposedly, by the French president that the UK should have some sort of reduced rights of membership during this extension period. And that was rejected by the other member states, who felt that it has to have either the full rights of membership or not at all. Therefore, we are participating in European Parliament elections in, I think, 2 weeks' time, 13 days' time. So Europeanization with the UK is not just in terms of the constitutional part of it, of supremacy. There's been other aspects. We look at policies, the idea of a social Europe, environmental standards. These have all been readily accepted by successive governments of different political persuasions. We look at the procedures in the UK. So look at Parliament in the EU, the scrutiny of European Union legislative proposals, the better regulation agenda, which is something that the UK and the EU have both shared very closely. They've both been very interested in pursuing better regulation as a principle, and the use of impact assessments, which again the UK has been very effective at using, and is something which has gained more credibility from its relationship with the European Union. We've also seen the role of the judiciary has been significant. We spoke this morning a little bit about the values and the principles of administrative law, and one part of that is the effective enforcement of EU law. British judges have been really very, very good at giving effect to EU law. Judgments such as factor tame demonstrate that significance. UK courts have also given effective remedies for breaches of EU law. The principles of direct effect and state liability have also been very much part of the judicial armoury over the last 45 years. But then the UK has also had other, I think, influences upon the European Union. The single market was really the brainchild of Margaret Thatcher and Lord Cockburn, who was Commission President at the time in the mid-1980s, to push for this integrated market where goods, services, capital and people could move freely. Competition law is very much based upon the UK interpretation of competition law of limited state aid, limited support from the state across a range of sectors of the economy. And things like the financial services sector and services sector more generally, the integration and cooperation in those areas has also been pushed very strongly by the United Kingdom. So Europeanization will have a legacy. And I've tried to draw parallels for something for this, of how to try and at least understand it or sort of benchmark what's happening. And I've looked at the relationship of the UK with the Commonwealth. And as the UK became less prominent in the Commonwealth because it became more integrated into the European Union, there was still this legacy effect of the Commonwealth relationship. So an irony, for example, is that European Union citizens who live and work in the UK and pay taxes couldn't vote in the referendum. But Commonwealth citizens could, simply by virtue of an enhanced status that Commonwealth citizens have under UK law. And I think that that's a parallel that's going to be quite interesting as we go forward. To what extent will the UK and the EU use that sort of legacy of the relationship to maintain this closeness? And this, I think, is a question which the UK is really struggling to answer. And I think this goes to the core of why there is such difficulty to agree a Brexit deal. So Parliament has been responsible for this, of trying to leave the European Union. And I've talked about this as the challenges of de-Europeanization. So we've got to firstly have to overhaul 45 years of primary and secondary legislation which have come from the European Union. How do you withdraw from an organisation which has produced so much of our statute book over the years? That's the first thing. The second thing is, how do you translate the referendum result, which is a populist expression of how UK citizens feel about the European Union, into a coherent legislative framework? Well, we do this by the EU Withdrawal Act of 2018, which is already a statute which is already a piece of legislation which is on the statute book. And this has created something called retained EU law. And the easiest way to understand this is that on the day that the UK leaves, the UK will in effect create a PDF document of the EU acquis on that day. And as it stands on that day is what will apply in the United Kingdom. Now, as with any document, it can change and evolve, but that will then be a matter for the UK to decide whether it sticks to that PDF document and continues to abide by EU rules, or does it want to diverge away from them. So that's the key point. The Withdrawal Act repeals the European Communities Act of 1972 and takes back that legislative control for Parliament, subject to a few exceptions on things like citizens' rights, and also during the transition period where the UK would continue to abide by EU rules and implement EU laws without being there at the table. Now, but this sounds all very straightforward, but it is extremely time-consuming. Parliament does not have the capacity, the expertise to be able to deal with this. In our project, what we've done is we've mapped how much time Parliament has spent on on dealing with Brexit since 2017, so since the general election of 2017, so just less than 2 years, 24% of all select committee reports are covering Brexit directly. And that's before we start talking about at least 55% of them which are covering Brexit indirectly. So Brexit has consumed Parliament in a way which has been very difficult for it to deal with. And though Brexit initially strengthened the executive at the expense of Parliament through the use of these things like these Henry VIII clauses, which would have allowed the executive, to change retained EU law without reference to Parliament, this balance has been redressed recently through the Letwin-Cooper Act, which is a backbench piece of legislation. Two backbench MPs, Oliver Letwin, a Conservative, Yvette Cooper, a Labour MP, who came together and pushed a bill through Parliament which prevents the UK from leaving without a deal, or at least requires the government to seek a deal with the European Union. So there's a positive legal obligation on the government to seek a deal. Now, the core of this problem that Parliament faces is this idea of direct versus representative democracy. How do you equate those two? How do you reconcile direct democracy, where the majority of people voted to leave, with representative democracy, where the overwhelming majority of the governing party, MPs, and cabinet ministers voted to remain? And this is where you've got the problem. You have a Remain Parliament. MPs are broadly Remain. Around 450, 460 MPs voted Remain at the general election, and they are having to give effect to a referendum result which they did not support. And this is obviously problematic. And on our website, which I'll give in there, we've got some statistics where we have analysed how MPs have behaved and how they have voted over the last 2 years. And you're welcome to go and have a look at them. So the Article 50 process is the key issue. And so it originally was the question of how does the government trigger Article 50, this 2-year period through which it is going to leave the European Union. And initially the Prime Minister said this is an executive matter. I, as the Prime Minister, will do this without reference to Parliament. And then a case was brought before the court, which ended up in the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, Miller versus Secretary of State, for exiting the European Union. And here the court said, for a number of reasons, but including one in particular, that Parliament has to pass an act to trigger Article 50. And one of the justifications of the Supreme Court in Miller was that once Article 50 is triggered, it is irrevocable. So you can't overturn an Article 50 notice. So that was one of the key elements for the Supreme Court's judgment. That's the reasoning that it gave. However, subsequently, in the case of Whiteman versus Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, the Court of Justice disagreed with that and said unilateral revocation of Article 50 is possible. Nothing precludes that from Article 50 at all. And so what we can see is that the Supreme Court has potentially got it wrong on that point. And if the Supreme Court had looked at that again and accepted the government's argument, because the government first of all started arguing that it was irrevocable and then decided to accept the point, it didn't take it any further, then we could have had a different outcome and the executive would have been in a potentially stronger position. So it's interesting how over a 2-year period we can see the legal interpretation of Article 50 has changed from where we thought it was originally. And that, I think, is very, very significant, because Whiteman creates a real problem in one sense for both government and Parliament, because the pressure to use that unilateral revocation is always going to be there if things begin to really implode. And constitutionally and economically and socially, that the UK can't cope with Brexit. So it's an interesting sort of almost like a nuclear option button, but it depends on who's going to press it. Will it be Parliament that pushes for it, or would it be the executive who presses that button? And we're not quite there yet, but I don't think we're that far away from that point either. So Parliament's decision to extend Article 50 is significant as well. It's now, we are now have got what we talk about. We're now talking about the second extension to Article 50 to the 31st of October 2019. And it is perfectly possible that the UK will seek further extensions after that. The interesting thing to note about the extension is that Parliament's decision to extend Article 50, well, Parliament requested that the government extend Article 50, but it's not Parliament's decision. The request can only be made. It's the EU 27 who have to make that decision. The UK, when it asks for extensions, is not in control of the process. And that's the whole narrative of Article 50. The UK has no control of the process. The EU dictates the terms and the conditions under which Article 50 takes. Taking back control, the European Union Withdrawal Act. So as I've said, what the European Union Withdrawal Act does is it reflects this populist mantra of the Prime Minister, of those who support Brexit, which is that it's taking back control of our money, laws and borders. It's a popular expression of sovereignty. As I've suggested, legally, it's about the transfer of competences back to the United Kingdom. And as I've said, the European Union Withdrawal Act creates this new category of law, retained EU law. The only bit of the treaty which it doesn't include is the Charter of Fundamental Rights. That is excluded from retained EU law, and the UK will no longer have any reference to the Charter whatsoever. Now, what retained law is essentially either EU-derived domestic legislation, so directives which have been implemented, direct EU legislation, so some treaty provisions, regulations, and thirdly, other rights and obligations arising from Section 2.1 of the 1972 Act. So that's, for example, giving effect to certain decisions of the Commission or Council, European Council regulations. Now, I suppose what you all think is we're leaving the European Union, and it means it's an end to the supremacy of European Union law. The principle of supremacy is gone. Well, it hasn't. One of the odd characteristics of the EU Withdrawal Act is that it preserves the principle of supremacy of EU law within the UK Constitution. If one looks at Section 4 of the Act, what it does, and then you look at Section 5, this expressly limits the applicability of the supremacy principle to the principal interpretation of conflicts between retained EU law and other pre-exit domestic law. So where you have retained EU law and an Act of Parliament which came before the UK left the European Union, retained EU law always takes precedent. So it's created a higher level of law under the UK Constitution, which is very strange for an unwritten constitution, that we have this higher level of law domestically. So the principle of supremacy continues to apply where retained EU law conflicts with pre-exit day domestic law. Now, if once the UK leaves and it passes legislation which conflicts with retained EU law, it's the new legislation which takes precedent. But until such time as that happens, the principle of supremacy continues to apply. And if one looks at Section 7.1 of the Act, this clearly states that pre-exit domestic legislation must be read subject to retained EU law and applied as before. So this higher status of EU law, of retained EU law, and we see this in Section 5 too, makes it very difficult to know precisely what is the status going forward of retained EU law, because what we haven't done in the United Kingdom is we haven't included all those remedies which make EU law effective. Direct effect is gone, because direct effect only applies if you're a member state of the European Union. The Frankovich principle of state liability has explicitly been rejected by this act, by the Withdrawal Act. So how this is going to be enforced, how this is going to be interpreted, if there's a conflict, is a question for the judges. And I think that's a fairly difficult position to hold if we are if the government is saying this is taking back control, because we are then leaving it to judges to interpret. And all the judges, I suspect, will do, certainly in the short to medium term, is look at what they had previously decided on a similar dispute, looked at what the Court of Justice had decided on a similar dispute, and continue to apply those rules and principles. So even though we leave, we will still, our judges will still be looking at what the Court of Justice is doing. So Brexit means Brexit. Well, this is really the question that I started with. Well, yes, it does, but it does create this intangible conundrum. So how can the supremacy of EU law, supremacy of retained EU law, continue to be meaningfully applied when Brexit rids the UK of all EU law? What is it supreme over? If it's supreme over other parts of the Constitution, well, that act doesn't say that, but that's the implication of that act. So Brexit means Brexit, but when it comes to the application of EU law, I suspect there will be many people who voted to leave who will end up being disappointed by the way in which the courts apply and interpret retained EU law. So the example that I've given there is, if we take something like the Working Time Directive, which talks about a 48-hour working week, I think over a 17-week continuous period, the Court of Justice has further refined and interpreted what 48 hours means. And by that we mean that if you are a junior doctor or a doctor, if you are on call but at rest, the clock stops ticking when you're at rest. Sorry, the clock continues ticking when you're at rest. If when we leave, the UK may decide, well, actually, we'll keep a 48-hour working week, but we will redefine how you make up those 48 hours. When you're at rest, the clock stops ticking for you. So in effect, you work longer for the same amount of money, and the 48 hours is still met. And so the question of how our courts interpret these ideas over the coming years is going to be really interesting, whether they maintain these Europeanized interpretations that we have. So I think that it means, at least for the short term, that's the transition period, and until such time as the UK comes to a final agreement with the European Union on all aspects of its relationship, which is probably going to take around a 5 to 7 year period on the most optimistic side, the UK will essentially become a rule taker. It will continue to follow EU laws, but without having a seat at the table. Because it will need to ensure that it has a functioning statute book and that it can continue to trade with the EU, it can continue to provide services to the EU, and to do that, it will have to meet the EU's regulatory standards. And that will not be a voluntary, it will be portrayed as a voluntary choice, but in effect, the UK will have no choice. So what will Brexit mean then? Well, we will legally, we are at this stage going to leave the institutions of the EU on the 31st of October. Politically, Brexit is defined by reference to music. And so some define Brexit as a Hotel California Brexit. So you can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. You continue to be there. I like the one, I made up another one, sort of going back to 50 ways to leave your lover. There's 50 ways to leave the EU. And that's the problem. That is precisely why we are where we are, because you haven't got any consensus on how member states want to leave, or how MPs want to leave the EU, and what the member states want from the United Kingdom. There isn't a consensus on both sides. So going forward, the issue is really going to be one for Parliament. And I think Parliament is at some point going to have to decide how it takes this forward. And I suspect Parliament's initial response is going to be, sooner rather than later, another general election rather than a referendum. Because a general election is really the only option there is to change the composition of Parliament, to try and get a different Parliament in place, which may be able to come up with a different decision. But that will also mean political parties making some difficult choices. But I do want to finish on an optimistic ending. And there's a lot of negativity about Brexit, and there's many negative things to be said. However, if we look at Brexit from another perspective, then Parliament exercising competences is going to, in one sense, put Parliament and MPs under the microscope. The idea that MPs will simply just be able to say, and we look at the white paper on governance in 2001, the Commission wrote, when the EU does something well, member states take the credit. When the EU does something badly, we blame Brussels. The UK will no longer be able to blame Brussels. And what we've seen since the referendum is much greater populist interest in the working of Parliament and scrutiny of MPs. And that's a good thing in one sense. People are more engaged with the political process. People are watching what's happening in Parliament and trying to hold MPs to the account. So I think in one sense, what will happen or could happen out of this mess is that in the end, democracy, political engagement, and parliamentary scrutiny of the executive will improve. But I think that's a long, long way off from where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very complete, brilliant, and stimulating presentation. Plenty of ideas. So, we have about 10 minutes for questions, comments. So, do you have the floor if you want to? Any question? I wanted to well, it is just a comment, and it is not a legal comment, but a political one. I would like to have your opinion on this. I think that one of the main mistakes was that the Parliament didn't take control of the process after Miller. I do agree with you in the sense that Brexit is not a fact, but a process with many, many different agents that have been intervening on these. But in my view, the main agent should have to be the Parliament. So don't you think that if Parliament had taken control after the judgment of the Supreme Court in the Miller case, things would have been different?
The difficulty with this is that Miller creates an impression that Parliament is going to have a greater say. And what it does is it requires Parliament to trigger Article 50, which it did. The problem is that once Article 50 was triggered, the government was saying it is negotiating a treaty to withdraw from the European Union. And treaties under the UK Constitution are negotiated by the executive. And whilst Parliament may define the mandate, may provide some scrutiny of what the process is going, or what's going on in the process. Those negotiations were conducted behind closed doors. Now, the reality was the European Parliament, the way British MPs found out what was happening in the negotiations was to speak to MEPs and go to the European Parliament, because there was much more information being given there than there was to UK parliamentarians. The problem with Parliament taking control, and to some extent it has, and we've seen this recently, where backbenchers using changes to parliamentary procedure have taken over the business of the House of Commons on a number of days. And on each of those days, they've tried to have what they call indicative votes, a series of votes where they've tried to come to some sort of alternative consensus on where Parliament will go. And as yet, no proposal, be it a second referendum, be it a no deal, be it something in between, has yet come up with a consensus within Parliament. And I think Parliament's role should be there to give confidence to the government of the day. And I think the problem with this is not necessarily Parliament, but it's the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. Because if we didn't have the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, that hadn't been introduced in 2011, the government would have gone months ago. But because of that act, it doesn't have to resign necessarily if it loses a vote, because it knows that an election is not going to be called automatically, and it will simply just come back to the Commons, and it will have its MPs voting in a measure of confidence in favour for it. So it's a constitutional problem where there are, in one sense, too many checks on the executive where they don't matter, but where they do matter, there's not enough. And that's a failing of our constitution at present.
Any other question or comments, please? Go ahead.
I have a question for Alan related to the role of the Supreme Court. Don't you think that the court should have made a reference for a preliminary briefing related to how it should interpret Article 50, in particular if revocation was a possibility open to the government or not? Because it is apparent that the Supreme Court is a court of last instance on the one hand, on the other hand, it is by no means applicable the doctrine of the eighth clear to the issue of whether the revocation could be decided unilaterally. So maybe, I don't know, maybe if the Supreme Court would have made that reference, finally the ECJ would have decided the case and would have interpreted Article 50, Section 3 in a different way. Don't you think that?
I suspect, I have no evidence for this, but I suspect there were a number of members of the Supreme Court who probably would have liked to have made a reference simply to clarify that point. However, you have to put that case in the context of newspapers referring to judges as enemies of the people. And if these enemies of the people were then going off to the even bigger enemies of the people in Luxembourg, that would have been politically and constitutionally devastating. I mean, we had the Lord Chancellor, not the Lord Chancellor, sorry, the Secretary of State for Justice, refusing to support judges in the Commons when was asked about this. Didn't condemn what newspapers were saying. And I think the judges felt that the only way they could deal with this, and this is how they explained it, was this. They took a very narrow interpretation of Article 50, and they focused on that bit which said, you leave the European Union under your own constitutional procedures. And they said, as far as that we're concerned, that's the bit that matters, and we will leave the European Union using our constitutional procedures, and therefore we do not need confirmation from Luxembourg on how to apply our constitutional procedures. But I think that there were judges there who would have preferred to have made that reference, but were prevented from doing so by the circumstances they were working in.
Any other question? Yes, Susanna.
Very briefly, one question: why don't you think, and it would be well that a second referendum is going to happen? So you think general elections is a better option or a more feasible option? Does it really mean that it wouldn't be a second referendum? Secondly, how do you read the results of recent local elections in the UK vis-a-vis Brexit, in case you think there is a link?
I mean, the first thing I would say is that whatever I say about second referendum or general elections, please don't hold it against me, because nobody has yet been able to say with certainty what happens. One of the challenges of researching into Brexit is that I spent months writing an article which I literally had to tear up and start again because things have changed, and this is part of the problem. We just don't know. I think a second referendum is at this stage not going to happen, because a second referendum which would be introduced by this Parliament, even if they got the numbers, there would be a real question of legitimacy. Why is this one more legitimate than the first? And that I believe is a genuine question which would need to be answered. And I also think that there should be honesty of what you want a second referendum for. Because a second referendum to confirm Theresa May's deal is really a second referendum to stop Brexit, because her deal would never get through a referendum. So that for me is almost, you're asking the wrong question there. And I don't think that is representing what the choice of citizens has been. So I think a general election is more likely on the basis that we have a government which is really run out of ideas. We have a government which has cancelled its Queen's speech. So it in effect has no programme that it is going to present before Parliament. And there's no legislative programme. It has no policies, no legislation going through Parliament for the next 3 years, potentially. So that, I think, is a statement, circumstances that can't continue. And I also think about a second referendum is the only way you could have it is if you have a general election in which a political party promises a second referendum for whatever reason, gets elected with a majority and puts that through. That delegitimizes the first referendum. But it has to, I think, go through a proper parliamentary process where the public have had some vote upon whether they want that referendum. So I think we actually have to go back a step rather than saying just give the public a confirmatory referendum. On the local elections, I just think I'm not sure how much it says about Brexit. I think it's just a position about how British politics has ceased to function, and where we have no party being popular. And on local issues, most people are mixing up Brexit with local issues, with national issues. And the organisation that I work with, the UK and the Changing Europe, produced some very good polling. There's a psephologist, a political scientist who looks at elections, Sir John Curtis, who's been around now for probably 45 years, looking at this. And he looked at these local election results and basically said they're irrelevant. We do not think this will make the slightest bit of difference to when it comes to a general election.
Any other question? Even in Spanish, please, if you want to. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Cygan. This is a non-stop session, so we will go on with the next panel.